As a reminder, there was a document associated with this meeting invite. If you could sign in and add anything to the agenda, that'd be awesome.
All right. Simon, did you want to continue facilitating? I think you were doing a great job.
That hadn't been my plan. I just filled out the the notes section for this week, but I can talk for a little bit. So, hello everyone. We may have a few new faces to this meeting. So I don't know if anyone that's not been along wants to say a quick hello.
Y'all might know me, but Micah, working a lot of the Windows contributions with some other folks here.
I'm Malini. I'm also working on the Windows contributions with Micah.
Great, welcome along. So we'll kick off with status updates. Anyone want to give a quick update where they are this week?
I could speak a little bit to some of the things that are going on in the background. So it does seem like we've gotten a little bit of traction or community input from, I'm not entirely sure if it's KubeCon. I know that Google's also have posted some Cloud Next related blog posts about their integration with Buildpacks. So we've seen a slight uptick of new members coming in asking for help. Some of the things that are coming up are related to like enterprise environments. So a lot of proxies, HTTP proxies, Linux environments with very specific security constraints. I think we've found some environments with older Docker versions not working quite well. So a lot of really positive feedback. Well, resolution of positive feedbacks. So that's been a lot of the work upcoming there. One of the things that has also come out of it is I created a milestone for docs, which I know that that isn't, pertinent to this specific subteam, but is maybe something worth looking at. So I'll add it as part of the release planning, but I've created a milestone for things about just questions that have come up that we probably want some better documentation around. That's it for me.
Anybody else? Cool. So then on to release planning.
So it's me talking again. So there's the milestones. I've created one for pack. I put it in the notes section. So there's one for pack. It's got quite a bit of stuff in there already that we've started working on. By all means, these are all open issues that anybody can feel free to contribute to. We're doing a lot of work around essentially minor issues that we've wanted to bring in for quite a while, as well as Buildpack registry is another big one, and then finalizing some of the Windows support to be able to get that more publicly available here in the next release. And the next item on the release planning is that docs milestone that I mentioned that has some of the questions that have come up as part of the KubeCon / Cloud Next conversations.
Should we add things like corporate proxy FAQ or something to that KubeCon?
So that's one of the things that is still to be added. There is an issue that was just opened about Docker mirroring or Docker registry mirroring, proxying, which is something that I'm also kind of going back and forth with them. But if you want to keep an eye out for all this stuff, this is the milestone that you want to look at and see if we could help out there.
I can see, looking at the 0140 label, we've got a target date of September 29th. Is that the CCB date for PAC 040 that we have in mind?
That would be the actual release date, if I remember correctly. So CCB or feature complete should be a week before that. And everything on here doesn't necessarily guarantee that it will make it into that release, right? It's a best effort for that date. And then whatever does not get in will just get pushed back onto the next release.
Any other questions for Javier around release planning or any other updates around releases? Okay. Windows dev tooling. So I know we've invited a couple of folks from our Windows containers team here in VMware to talk about how the actual development process works. Take it away.
Yeah, Dan had invited us, so if you want to set the context.
Yeah, so I guess one of the discussions we've kind of been having is balancing some of the tooling that we can use at like VMware versus what open source contributors have to use when they're developing against Pact and inevitably run into a bunch of Windows tests that they need to get to pass or have broken. And so before we like spend some time and come up with solutions that work for us, probably want to figure out what this like common piece is that we're going to give to everybody. So
I think that makes a lot of sense, yeah. And I've been sort of feeling this, like just to lay out how we tend to work for Windows stuff. We're usually developing on Macs. We usually have a readily available Windows daemon somewhere, usually running as a VM on our Macs. And we usually just set Docker host equals IP address for the VM and run all the tests, and they run against Windows and generally all pass if we did our jobs right. But it's relying on a few things. Obviously, we have to have a license for the VM to run it. We also potentially have a license for Fusion, which we usually use to run the VMs on there too. And it's also not the most secure setup. The VMs are running with an exposed, unencrypted TCP port. So it really makes our particular solution only work for a local scenario. And all the licensing baggage that comes with that. So we kind of just solved for the immediate need that we had. Technically speaking, there's a different world that we could have gone. We could have been developing entirely on Windows machines using a local Windows daemon. I feel like that still has all the same licensing baggage with it, but maybe it's easier to assume that most devs would have a Windows license, but not necessarily Fusion and Mac and all the rest of that. But it also comes with just a code cost that most Linux make scripts and tools and things don't necessarily work, or they'll work on the Mac, but they won't necessarily work on Windows. And so I feel like what we've tried to do is to keep our development process as similar as possible to what we think would be the average contributor to CMBs, but in the meantime, bolt on this one extra thing that we think is useful for us. Now, we wanted a solution, I think, having the options that we did of getting licenses and that, but there's a few different ways to tweak that same model, that default working on a Mac or a Linux desktop and setting a Docker host to a Docker host somewhere else. The VM doesn't necessarily have to be local. You can, play with make a secure Docker daemon that's running up on a GCP instance or something like that, or it could be running on your Windows machine. You could be doing, if you're a Windows developer, you could be running on WSL on an actual Windows machine, but in a Linux mode, targeting a daemon that's sitting there too. A whole bunch of different knobs to turn. So I wouldn't want to assume that the way that we do it is necessarily the right solution for the community contributors. I'd love to hear other thoughts or approaches, especially pain points too, that folks feel like they're having.
Are there any restrictions to a remote Docker host? I'm thinking like volumes. Does every feature work properly through a remote Docker host?
The volumes is a good call. It works, but differently. The volumes are local to the remote VM. So if you're mounting a path, you're bind mounting a path into that container, it's going to be from your remote Windows daemon. There's ways to sort of mitigate that. We've tried to write all the make tasks so they don't rely on that kind of functionality, and like some of the other tooling around there, it'll use a Docker CP instead to move the source code over there before you run everything. Tried to, but a few of those, at least just from a pack user perspective, might be a little surprising. But from a dev perspective, I think we've worked around most of the quirkier bits.
Yeah, I guess what I'm thinking is, I think in this context, we're talking about a contributor development experience, right? And in that sense, I'm trying to think of what that would mean if you were to need to create a new test for Windows volumes with a remote Docker daemon. I think feels very strange, right? And I guess maybe the part that I also question is whether the statement of having a Mac or Linux development environment to like that. In my experience, that hasn't always been true, especially if it's not somebody that's working for an organization, right? But maybe I'm just tailoring to a very specific niche.
So you feel like a Linux dev case should be the one that we optimize for?
No, I'm thinking some people actually do develop on Windows. I know it's crazy, but yeah.
If they already have a Windows license, like I feel comfortable saying, do all your development in Windows Subsystem for Linux. You have a nice little Windows terminal there, Windows kernel that moves everything over for you. Like run it there, and then it's almost like working on a native Linux machine. You can switch your backend from Linux containers to Windows containers. Like I feel like that WSL case is pretty smooth, and I kind of almost want to do it myself. If you feel like that would be, if that's acceptable to say for someone who's using Windows desktop, just use WSL, then I feel like that's might be solved already.
I guess, I don't know. I think I brought this up at some point with some individuals, but I was curious whether or not breaking up the two components, right? Which is one, having a development machine like a Docker host, machine, right? One that has Docker set up and has whatever tooling might be necessary for local development within that Windows domain or context. That could be one piece of the puzzle, right? And then if you then needed to attach to it remotely because you happen to work on a Mac or Linux machine, then that's a different piece of the puzzle with different, configuration or guidance. And so I think if we break it that way, and then we talk about the former, where everything's set up within a Windows context with WCal in a Windows machine, then those individuals that do happen to develop on Windows automatically get that, that very quick start, if that makes sense.
I feel like that's a good call. Yeah. I feel like the hybrid case that we support now is probably, or that we as the Melanie and myself and some of our team members, is a little strange. It happens to work pretty well just once we figured it out. But I feel like if you, and I am pretty sure this does work now, but if you're assuming that you have a Windows developer, I feel like they're in the ideal case because then they can work all in a Linux terminal and then switch to LCOW, WCOW, however they wish to. And I'm pretty sure that already works really well. I feel like their dev experience is probably best and better than ours.
Yeah, and in that case, it's just about, and I think this is where the question of whether or not we can improve this comes into play. There is still some development setup, right? Like you have to probably set up Cygwin, right? If you want to run Bash and Make to be able to do the local development. I don't know if we want to be suggestive on the IDE, right? Like VS Code versus something else, but it's those minor setups, right? I see Simon shaking his head. I agree, we should not be, but nonetheless, like there is some development setup that we need in order for you to be able to build. Like you have to install Go, right? Like that kind of stuff. And so a lot of that to me comes as like automation, right? Like I wonder if it would be helpful to be able to have some setup script or automation that says, okay, just run this and it'll set up all the stuff necessary, right? How well it's compartmentalized and reusable, I think that's a different question, something that could be worked out there, but that's at least my train of thought.
That's a great idea. In fact, actually, Anthony on our team has done a little dev automation for the sort of, compartmentalized VMs that we have. It uses Packer, but 90% of what it does is just run local scripts inside of a VM to configure it to be in the right state. We haven't quite finished it. It's also meant for standing up Fusion VMs right now. I think it's super easy to port to run on any platform that Packer runs on. But if you feel like Packer is a viable tool, we could kind of polish this off the work that we've started so far.
I think that's what I lean towards, but I do want to get other people's opinions, right? And see whether or not this is a venture we should even be trying to pursue.
Just for some context, like we, here at Salesforce, I think we're issued either Linux or Mac by default. I think I do have a Windows laptop that was issued. It's not up to date enough to get WSL2, I don't think. I don't think they enabled that by like default. So just kind of throw that out there, which does cause some inconsistencies in the tooling, obviously, as well as performance. And I guess from my personal standpoint, it would be nice if I put a PR up to Packer lifecycle and there are Windows tests, that I think the main thing is making sure the tests fail in a way that's easy to read for people who are unfamiliar or less familiar with Windows, as well as potentially having at least a documentation on, if you don't have a Windows box, what do you do? Can you like fork lifecycle and then can your GitHub action, can we have a default GitHub action that maybe you can put like an ngrok tunnel key or something in there so that you can like SSH to it on failure? Like I've seen some, kind of like Circle CI's SSH and stuff like that. I wonder if there's some steps that we could eventually take that would allow us to, let people ease into at least getting some visibility into the test that they're trying to fix. If that's their whole goal, is to like fix this one test and they don't understand what it looks like and they don't have Windows set up.
Yeah, that's good data points there. So one thing I was going to mention about the WSL part, we are currently targeting Windows enterprise. So the at least what we've seen is the most common version of Windows that we'd see at our corporate style customers. It does only support WSL 1, but I'll have to go back and validate, but I'm pretty sure the test should be able to run on that one. I'd be interested in your all thoughts on what's the right version of Windows to go with for the ideal case, because enterprise, you can download almost any version of Windows 10 from Microsoft, except for the version that we're targeting. You can't actually get 1809 without a license, and yeah, of course, the most common one is the one that make you pay for. But we could, yeah, I think that'd be interesting to see what y'all think about that. Also, as far as the test reproducibility, we had done a little bit of work, or in the CI failure reproducibility and the clarity of the error messages. We've done a little bit of work to make the lifecycle tests run exclusively in a Docker container. So if it fails in CI, you can be guaranteed to reproduce it locally. The idea being that you don't necessarily know all the tools and stuff that are going to be up on CI and the environment differences, but if you put all those dependencies inside of a container to begin with, and then talk to your daemon however you have to, but keep all your packed dependencies in one container, it's likely to fail exactly the same way in CI as it is in locally. There's a lot of overhead that goes along with doing that. It's just harder to make tests and code and everything run perfectly inside of a container. But if we feel like that reproducibility is important enough, we could look into that as one solution. I do think now what we've seen is that whenever we make a fork or open a PR, all the Windows tests do run, and yeah, and occasionally the test failures will be a little opaque or Windows specific, but at least you do get that coverage for a PR.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, like a drive-by PR who only has experience on Linux, are they going to be able to debug those tests efficiently? Or do we need to have some sort of hook for them to be able to, not have to have a Windows box? Like you said, you can reproduce it if you have a Windows box, but if you don't, is that PR just dead in the water without a contributor who has Windows set up?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I mean, I know part of that, the maintainers should be there to assist in those scenarios, and maybe, I think one of the things we've incorporated here recently is the polish PR, where it addresses any minor changes. And I feel hesitant calling a Windows test failing a minor case, right? But if it's something that would ease that tension or remove some of that friction, it may be worth doing. I love the idea of having an ephemeral development box, or something that you could point to. Feasibility, though, I don't know exactly how we could get that, right? It seems like you pointed at Circle CI as potentially offering that. I know.
I don't know if they offer what we need necessarily, but I just know that like GitHub, the SSH ability is something that I think could be useful, so that you could rerun things and experiment with stuff like, okay, well, the other Windows tests have this like bin detect batch file. Maybe I need to create one of those and rerun the test, and like being able to iterate in some way without having to have access to your own Windows box would be an ideal step.
Yeah, I think when we've talked about this as an internal team, the focus has often come down to the security concerns about giving people SSH access to random boxes on the internet.
Yeah, and I think if the GitHub CI actions run on their account, then that's okay, right? Like maybe it just, by opting into having to set up your own ngrok tunnel token or something like that, then it's sort of, your deal at that point, right? Like now you can SSH into the container that runs the Windows tests, and its security concerns are local.
I mean, for what it's worth right now, I believe both of the Windows runners, lcal and wcal, are both ours or managed by the Cloud Native Build project. So it's still sensitive, but it is isolated in a sense. So the risk is very, very minimal. Yeah, I mean, I think I like that as a feature. Again, I question the feasibility of being able to support that, as especially in the short term. I think long term is very possible. Short term, I don't think it would be our first step, right?
How would y'all feel about putting more of the runtime dev environment into a container, and with the goal of, if it fails in CI, you're almost guaranteed to be able to rerun the same container, maybe one that CI even saved for you from your failed run. If you rerun it, then it fails locally. And I mean, you still need a Windows daemon somewhere to run that against, but like if the environment differences are able to be captured in a container, like, do you feel that that's would be useful in your dev workflow?
I think just thinking about this practically, right? Like I'm thinking, okay, so test is going to fail. I want to update my branch, make changes to it, and ultimately run the tests with a very short feedback loop, right? Like I would through my IDE. And I'm not sure that having, like, I don't see how that would happen, right? Like how exactly do you envision me updating the code and being able to run that code within that container?
Yeah. Well,
Maybe something worth exploring more.
something we have in Lifecycle, just to put a context around it, is we have a make task where you can say make run Windows essentially, and then any string you pass after that gets run inside of a Windows container, but using your current uncommitted source code from your repo. So you essentially, like, if the workflow is make run it against the container ID I saw that failed in CI, and all it's doing is schlepping your source code into that container that failed or something like that. Like, do you feel like if it got down to that level of simplicity, that might be feasible? Or is that, I mean, it also might be too dreamy to even work, so.
I like dreamy. uh, yeah, no, I think that seems really good, right? Especially somebody that like really just finds it painful to have to set up a Windows environment. The downside is you still need that Windows daemon somewhere. And I
Yeah.
think that's maybe more at the core of the problem than anything.
There's a little bit on that. So we do have like at least with the way our team is set up, is we do have a shared daemon that we can use if we want to. We can also run it on our desktop, or there's one that's on our VPN right now. I was writing a blog post along with Joe about a way to harden a daemon in the cloud. Oh, I guess we're at time too. Sorry.
It's all right. I mean, please feel free to keep going, at least for me.
Okay. So the way essentially what you end up with is the equivalent of like SSH secured Docker daemon up in the cloud. So anyone who knows the secret for it can access it. The secrets are actually TLS, mutual TLS certs. So, you know, if we had someone who we knew we trusted to use the daemon, say it's a regular contributor or just someone who we know that will throw away the thing after this, if we gave them issued them a new client cert with the command line utility or something like that, gave that to them and said, you know, go at it, debug. Like I feel like that's about as good as we could get with this shared daemon. Beyond having someone, you know, on their own GCP account, stand up a VM based on a script that we have, and then, you know, use their own VM to do that. They would still need to deal with some TLS stuff to make it secure, or SSH or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So two things. I think both of them are very, very viable, right? One of them is giving people a guide to set up a Windows daemon in a cloud provider, right? I think most people that work in this realm will at least have one of the cloud providers. And so giving them the option to choose their provider, right? Give them a very quick guide. And then most importantly, give them like, hey, this is the script. This is the thing that you execute. And it just sets up this, you know, very quick setup for you to be able to do this. And then how that ties into TLS and making that secure, right? Making that as easy as possible seems very viable and very useful for that experience of, hey, I found an issue. What do I do next? We could point them to this guide of like, hey, set up your Windows machine on a cloud provider. I think that's a really good way to go about it. Creating the shared environment where we could provide, you know, certs. Question is, can we revoke those certs? Is that a possible operation, or rotate them, or?
I'd have
You're
to dig
just
in.
kind of trusting people to do that for you.
Well, the more clever way I figured out how to do it is you actually just stand up a Docker container that is your cert go-between, a Docker container that speaks socket and or inputs TLS and outputs to this Docker daemon socket. I actually made a little proof of concept that does that. So in that case, if you wanted to rotate a cert, you could just have one shared cert that everybody uses and then expire the whole thing, recreate the TLS termination container, recreate the client certs. However you wanted to do that, if you just wanted to keep it super simple and brute force, you could do it that way. If you want to get fine grain and be a CA yourself and maintain a certificate revocation list and issue client certs individually for everybody, you can do that too with the same model. So it would be I'd have to dig into exactly how to do that, but I know that there is a way to do mutual TLS with certificate revocation. But the simpler, or at least the dumb simple way of doing it is just recreate your server cert every time you want to expire someone.
Yeah. Cool. That makes a lot of sense. I don't know that that's ultimately necessary from the get-go. I think if we were to envision sharing a resource, right, it would be very similar to what the project currently does, where we do share resources, right, like GCP account information, all that stuff, and it's to project contributors that have then identified themselves, right, and then we at that point kind of trust them at a certain degree enough to give them that information. So I think very similar concept here is we could set something like that up, and once they get that level of project contributor where we're already providing them, infrastructure information, we could very easily provide them with this and have that level of trust there. So we wouldn't be giving it to any, random community contributor, but most likely to one of those that has already contributed and gone up that tier.
That's good to know. And I'll think about that through technical solutions of how to follow that model of having a few trusted people. Like, I think there's a few ways to tweak it, even without TLS that might work, like over
Cool.
SSH or something instead.
Dan, does that give you enough to go off for now? Cool. All right. Yeah.
That's a great solution. The drive-by PR person is something we can probably worry about later on once we have this process solidified.
Yep. Awesome.
And in the meantime, they still get a little bit of CI feedback. They're not great feedback, but they can try that.
Yeah, and if the ultimate goal is to provide a guide and some way to automate that setup, I think that would satisfy my personal goals or vision of what I would see this looking like. And that's even something I could pursue if I really want that to come true.
Then I feel like the Packer scripts that Anthony started feel like the closest thing to that. Let me see if I can find a way to share those with the community and go that route, if that makes sense.
Awesome. That'd be great. Yeah.
Cool.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.